Howdy, folks, and welcome to Moose Podcast 256. Hey, what a great week. I want to thank all of you who were part of Photoshop World. Dropped by, said hello, had great questions. Even though we weren't face to face in the normal kind of Photoshop World genre, you guys sure made me feel like you're right there, and I appreciate ever so much your support and being part of that really great event. So thanks so much. Also want to thank my good friends at Bedford Camera, bedfords.com. They have got all sorts of great stuff going on, which includes sales on some killer gear. So you want some great advice, great gear, great prices, and of course, save yourself some real money with that special discount, MOOSE. Make sure you reach out to my good friends at Bedford's Camera. And remember to tell them thanks for sponsoring the Moose Podcast. Well, let's get right into this week. Anxiety to learn. Now, this was a long time ago. I was a junior in high school. I had been working. It saved my money up, given it to my dad. He went to our favorite store back then to buy camera gear, Fedco, and it was a volleyball match. I was at the service line, and he walks into the gym because he was a great dad. He would be at every game, almost every game that was at home. And he walks in, and underneath his arm is the box with the new 200 millimeter that I worked so hard to save for. And he walked in, he smiled, he pointed at it. I bounced the ball a couple times on the floor, threw the ball up, served it right into the net. And he shook his head, and the coach kind of shook his head, and the team was kind of bummed. And I was so excited because that lens was there, I forgot everything else I was supposed to be doing. Well, that instant came to mind when I was working with a student, and their anxiety to learn was such that they couldn't learn. They couldn't learn. Their excitement was so over the top that they weren't hearing a thing I was saying. They were just hitting every ball in the net. They could not get anything going. And sometimes, when you're out there shooting and you've got a critter, we call it buck fever, and you could kind of relay this to that. But after I worked with that student, I thought about it for a while, and they weren't the first one to have such anxiety to learn that they couldn't get past themselves. And that excitement, of course, that's really important in photography. It's important to keep that excitement forever. I try, I'm about to take off on another road trip, and I've got a great ending event and going off doing some of my own work. And yeah, I'm so excited that I'm pulling out the checklist and going over them 3 times. Just don't forget to take what I need. Now, one of the things that this particular student was trying to grapple with was, well, if you listen to the podcast or read the blog or book, I don't use tools like a histogram or other things when it comes to exposure. What I use is simply how I feel, how I want to tell the story, and how I want you to feel about all that when you look at the photograph. And I expose based on that. And they had a hard time understanding that. And they were just so excited. They weren't hearing how I was trying to say it. And I know all too well that communication is a two-way street. Just because it makes perfect sense when I say it, it doesn't mean that it makes perfect sense to you when you're listening to it. And repeating it, what I just said, doesn't help. So I have to reword it all, hoping that mixing up the words might somehow sink in. Yeah, I was getting nowhere. And so I got, well, what is the simplest terms I can express this? And I don't really think they are a particularly emotional person, as in, they see a real touching moment in a movie. I don't think they cry. I'm not sure they're real huggers. So I'm like, boy, how can I put this in terms? 'Cause I was really striking out. And then I said, okay, how about this? When you really feel moody and you really want some dark mood to come out, maybe some real drama, how about you underexpose? And you're feeling kind of so-so. Just expose normally. And if you're really happy or you're just really, want to show some glorious thing, how about you overexpose? And they said, why didn't you say that in the first place? That makes perfect sense to me. And I said, I don't know. I'm stupid, I guess. How do we clear our minds so when we're out shooting, because this whole thing happens when we're at the camera as much as when we're trying to learn, and we see that a magic moment in the viewfinder, how do we clear our minds to bring it into the final photograph? I mean, in all seriousness, right? We get so excited. We've got this shot. How do we settle down and put it in the simplest terms so when we go click, we bring that excitement back? And here's the thing. I don't think I have that answer. And that's what's been plaguing me ever since, I realized this anxiety to learn is universal. I have one dear friend that forever been able to have the good fortune to shoot with them. And I often say to them 10-2. And that goes back to, as I've mentioned before, fly fishing and, casting 10-2 and you taking your time and take deep breaths and, think it through and relax and let everything come through that viewfinder so we can go click. It's in the thing, in the viewfinder, in the photograph. How do you get there? That brought me to working with a couple other people in the digital darkroom. And Photoshop, in many ways, is like photography in that you just can't take one technique that you learn and go, that's it, and apply that to everything that you want to finish and think that that's really it, because it's not. There are so many different ways. I mean, first, you got to remember that Photoshop is the adult video game. So right off the bat, you have lots of options to get to the same point. Next, just because it worked on photo A doesn't mean this technique will work on photo B. That's for so many reasons. And lastly, there is that overshadowing, thing called quality, that has to be in the click of the camera and the click of the mouse to make it all work. So for example, you have a photograph and you have an area in that photograph, and this comes back to exposure. You have an area of the photograph that you want brighter. Now you got to remember that once that photograph comes into that computer, all the information you're going to have is there. There's, it's all in the ones and zeros. They're all packed into that screen on Photoshop. And if you want to make an area brighter, you can go to that area and literally select it and lighten it. The problem is when you do that, a lot of times it's already the brightest spot in the frame, and you make it brighter right off the bat, you can break pixels. And in this case, you could have everything from pixel bloom to have zero information. It's just paper white. In other words, when you print that photograph, that particular area that's bright, all you're going to see is paper. The printer won't even lay down ink, paper white. Now, what if that little bright area had a little bit of information? Let's say it's in a cloud, because we all can relate to clouds, and it had just a breath, a little bit of gray in there to give just a tad definition of curves and a sense to that cloud. And you want it brighter, and you go with that method, which most people do, is you select the area, make it brighter, or you use adjustment curve and paint in brightness. All of a sudden, that very small subtlety disappears. And remember, the drama is a lot of little subtlety added up. That's how you get drama in a photograph. Lots of little subtleties. And you start wiping them out with that technique because you're so anxious to get it, you just shot yourself in the foot. So rather, I always encourage people, if you want to make something area brighter, make elements around it darker. How does that work? Well, it's just the way the mind's eye sees things. It says, if this is dark, this must be lighter. And you could call it tricking the eye because, that's technically what you're doing, right? But if you want to make an area brighter, don't touch it. Make the areas around it darker. Does it have to be like black? No, just darker. We get so anxious to, if I go back to my days when I was really little and I first started making models, my dad would get really frustrated with me. I would be so anxious to have it finished that the glue was still sticking on my fingers all over the model as I'm trying to paint the darn thing because I started 5 minutes ago and I want it done. I don't know if you did that. I did that. It took my dad a long time to convince me to let, just to use a little bit of glue and let it dry and let it sit there and follow the instructions. Oh, that was really hard for me. Oh God, reading instructions. And then you know what I'm talking about. A lot of people are that way with their photography. I posted a time lapse this past week, and I had two people email and said, "How'd you do that? How'd you get lightning?" And I said, "Well, I had the camera running 24/7 for 5 days." "Yeah, but how'd you get the lightning?" And I'm like, well, so here's the thing. The camera was shooting a time lapse, and I had the camera going for 5 days. "Yeah, but how'd you get the lightning?" "I was lucky." "Oh, okay, that's what I thought it was." The point being, I saw the possibility. That's why I went to Monument Valley in the monsoon season. I had the Z6 connected to AC. It was plugged into the wall. I wasn't running batteries. And I had one body and one lens on a tripod on the balcony of the room there at the View. And all it did, day and night, was simply run and shoot the time lapse. And the camera created the movie. But that particular sequence you see in the time lapse was from like I want to say it was the last day. I had a whole lot of, clouds going by. I had at least one day where there was just shadows. There's no clouds. And then luckily that last day, I had the clouds, the shadows, and the brief lightning storm that happened to go by in the background as it did. And I made the shot. Yeah, this thing that we want to do about photography, it is really, this magical thing. We're so fortunate to be able to do that at times we can't get out of our own way because we're in such a hurry to see that final photograph. We forget all that goes into that final photograph. And remember, that final photograph actually is not the final photograph, because tomorrow we're going to go out and shoot again, and that's not going to be the final photograph. And the next day and the next. It's good to be excited, but I think a big part of photography is just enjoying what it is to be a photographer, which means the failures and the successes, the missed moments, the caught moments, and sharing those and all that story with anybody who wants to listen. So when you get that knot in your stomach and you got this anxiety to learn, remember just to take a deep breath. 10-2. It all will come to you. I trust you guys are going to have a great week. Keep on shooting. I'm here if I can be of assistance. And remember to make every click your story.